Hey guys, as we are gearing up for Christmas, I want to show you a few cool artifacts, go back and tell some of the story. Obviously, as we are celebrating Christmas this year, people are coming from different places. There's been a pandemic, there's inflation, there's issues in our nation. Issues around Christmas time are not a new thing. If you back up to World War II, really incredible moment, the Battle of Bulge happening actually during Christmas time. And this is where we might have talked about before, General Patton does this really cool prayer card leading up to this battle where he's encouraging the soldiers, we need to pray. If God doesn't help change the weather, then this battle might go the wrong direction. There's a lot of cool elements to that, but since General Patton's the guy we're talking about, let's back up and tell a little bit more of his story, because it gives some context to kind of one of these really cool pieces of history about how faith was involved, and certainly around Christmas time makes it special. So let's back up to Patton.
Yeah, go back to early 1900s, because that's when Patton was a young man. He wanted to be in the military. He goes to a military school. The problem is he has dyslexia at a time when most people have no clue what dyslexia is. And so he was not a very good academic student, and academics was part of the military colleges back then. So where he went, I think, to VMI, he didn't do there, so he ended up in another military college. And later he joked about that because he never was a guy to let any hardship stand in his way. He's going to overcome anything. And he would joke about his dyslexia. He said, I am so much more creative than you guys are. I can spell the same words so many different ways. And that's kind of how he handled it, was he just kind of made fun of it. But as a young officer, he's involved in so many firsts. He is involved at the time of Pancho Villa and all the trouble along the southern border between Mexico and the United States. He's actually involved in the very first time that mechanized cars are used in battle, and that's down in the Mexico stuff. So he ends up being a very good swordsman. He's actually in the Olympics of 1912, and one of the things he did in the Olympics of 1912 was fencing with a sword. And he became so good that he was known as the master of the sword in the Army. And back then, he's in the cavalry. And in the cavalry back in the early 1900s, you're still using swords off horseback, and he was a great horseback rider. And this is a sword that he did in 1913. It's called the Patton sword. This was done for the Army. It was designed by him for use in the Army. It really is a remarkable sword. To hold that, its balance is great.
And it's worth noting that if you go back to the cavalry, generally you'd find more of a curve, right, in their sword, their saber, what they're carrying. And Patton spent some time over in France. And in France, and for their mounted, I guess, infantry-ish, but their cavalry, so to speak, they would use a pointed sword. And one of the things he discovered was that there was a greater effect, really lethality, if you would poke the sword into a person rather than just slashing at them. And so this was kind of his idea he brought back and said, hey, instead of having a saber on horse that we're used to kind of sweeping down at people, we need something that we can stab people and there's greater lethality. So this was one of his designs, and going back, like, this is actually one of those original ones production that was done from what Patton had designed, and this is after the Olympics, and he's been involved in France. So a lot of interesting things that he develops, even contributing to the military before he's really a well-known guy.
Yeah, and in the military, one of the other things he contributed to was the use of tanks in the military. He is assigned really the first unit of tanks in the military, and he eventually in World War II becomes the tank guy. Just like Rommel was for Germany, it was Patton for the United States. And so
which is not something people generally hear about.
That's right. It's not, but that's really what made his name in World War II.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, in World War II, it's interesting that when we get hit by the Japanese in Pearl Harbor, December the 7th of 1941, we were not ready for war at all. And so by the time we actually get, and when we get hit by the Japanese is when actually the allies of the Japanese, both the Italians and the Germans declare war on us. So most of the war is going on in Europe at that time, so that's where we first get involved. We don't do a whole lot in Japan except to do a little raid just to remind Japan that we're going to come after you later. And so we get involved, and it's really, it's in late 1942. It's a year later before we send troops over, and Patton is the one who takes those troops over. So he lands in North Africa in late 1942. He goes across North Africa with tanks, really revolutionizes a lot of the ways that things are being done, because we had guys with tanks there in North Africa and they just weren't doing good. And so Patton is the guy who steps in and says, here's how you do tanks. And he started winning all these victories in North Africa, and it really is significant.
And we have several letters from him. This one we can probably reference later as we're doing a video getting ready for Christmas time. It actually says Christmas Day. He's writing to his mom, and it's actually terrible chicken scratch scribble. So Like, good luck trying to read this. Later, you'll find it online. We'll post it. You can go try to read it. It's not easy. Nonetheless, Patton letter from Christmas Day to his mom, so kind of cool. But this is one a little more significant to military history, especially World War II, getting ready to go overseas to more of the European theater.
Yeah, this is a letter that he writes to some of his general friends, and he's about to deploy from the United States to North Africa. It's a secret mission. And so as he's about to deploy, he's talking about really the fighting that's going on among the ranks and where's he going to be in it. And all these generals are vying for the stuff. Well, he's already been given command of the unit that's going to North Africa. And by the way, he actually is the guy who liberates Casablanca. Now, if you know much about classic movies, there's a famous movie called Casablanca.
Here's looking at you, kid.
That's right.
Play it again, Sam.
All those lines, and they were planning to release that movie much later, but he went in and liberated Casablanca, much like you see in the movie, and so they moved the movie up because that's in the news, and so here's the movie. So that Casablanca, it's fun to watch again, thinking about the fact that Patton is the one who really kind of moved that movie forward because of what he did. So after they go through North Africa, you come to the point where that Patton now has a name. The Germans know him, and he is the guy who's winning stuff where other generals could not win stuff in Africa. And so as it comes time for D-Day, the Germans have their eyes on Patton because where he is, we want to be aware of where he is. And that's where Eisenhower really does something pretty cool with Patton. He creates a completely fake U.S. Army and puts it over in England like we're going to get ready to attack. And so the Germans are all focused on Patton. And what they did was they created dummy tanks, inflatable tanks, so that when the Germans fly over and they got intelligence, oh, there's 100 tanks down there. No, it's 100 inflatable dummy tanks. They had dummy cargo ships. They had dummy airplanes. And so Patton's over there inspecting all this stuff. And from the air, man, Patton's got this big army. He's about to come after us. And so where they thought Patton was going to come, where all this stuff was lined up, is not where D-Day happened. So the Germans are literally watching him, and D-Day it's like a magician. Watch this hand. No, you need to watch this one.
And let's point out, so there's a lot to this story. We won't give it all now, but we're in the middle of working on second and third volumes of the American story. And so this is why, Dad, you've been doing a lot of research regarding, would be in the third installment of the American story, telling a lot of the story of World War II and some of the heroes involved, Patton being one of those guys. And Patton was a guy definitely rough around the edges, had a lot of conflict in the midst of the military, a lot of issues with generals and leaders, and so there's some demotion and just all kinds of drama. But one of the things that's so cool about this, and the reason, again, Christmas Day, we want to talk about this leading up to Christmas, is Patton, when he gets assigned up in the mountains and told you have to hold the mountains, he recognizes the significance of needing good weather for some of these operations and knows that if we can just have good weather, we could win these operations. Well, Patton...
And let me explain that real quick, because what happened, the American tanks, the Sherman tanks that Patton is in charge of, all these tanks, they're not nearly as good as the German tanks, either the Panzers or the Tigers. So tank to tank, we get blown apart. We lose. But what we've got is we've got an Air Force with P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts that love taking out German tanks. And so Patton and his tanks, once the German tanks have been really kind of wiped out from the air, it's easy for him to proceed and take towns and just, he's kind of like Blitzkrieg on the American side taking towns. So for him, his tanks, he's a great guy with tanks, but if he doesn't have that air support, he can't beat the Germans. And the problem was, while he was over there in Europe, the weather was bad nearly all the time.
Mm-hmm. And so, again, Patton, very rough around the edges. If you go back, you'll find a lot of profanity in a lot of what he did. In fact, he actually says that he thought profanity helped inspire the men and like get them on focused, right? He thought if you just talk nicely to them, they don't understand, like it's wartime. He said, I got to cuss at them so they know I'm serious. So he's very rough around the edges. And in the midst of that, he still is actually very cognizant of God and recognizes he needs God's help in this. So there's a little bit of a dichotomy in this, and it's one of the reasons when we study history, we really love digging into the details and finding some of that nuance. All that to be said, Patton was a very faithful man of prayer, and there's some very cool moments in this era of World War II where Patton very openly goes to God and says, God, here's what we need, except a lot of times, like the Bible talks about, take your requests before God. Well, Patton didn't necessarily go with requests. Patton went and said, God, here's what you need to do. So let's unfold that real quick.
So we're now in Europe after D-Day, and we're trying to push the Germans back into Germany. And as we're doing that, there's two armies going and pushing them back. In the north is Courtney Hodges, in the south is Patton. And Patton's watching the Germans, and all these German units keep disappearing. He says, you know what, I think they're getting ready for a counterattack, and they're going to attack Courtney Hodges, and he doesn't recognize it. I'm going to have to turn my army and go save him. And literally that's what happens. The Germans have a huge counterattack. They penetrate the American lines. They go 60 miles behind the Americans. And Eisenhower says, Patton, you need to go up there and help him. Patton says, I've been waiting for this. I've been planning for this. I knew it was coming. And so as he starts moving toward, and it's called the Battle of the Bulge, and St. Vith and Bastogne, other places where the Germans had taken, the Americans are holding out now against the Germans. Instead of us being in charge, the Germans are in charge. They're waiting for Patton to get there to help. And as he goes through, as he's coming from the south going north to take on the Germans, he comes into the town of Luxembourg. And in Luxembourg, there's a church there. And at this point, he really is upset over what's happening because we have so much superiority in the air, but he's losing thousands and thousands of soldiers to Germans when if we had some planes in the air, we would be winning everything. And so he's even now, because of all the bad weather, he's lost 15,000 of his soldiers to frostbite, having lost fingers and toes. It's so bad. The foxholes are filled with water and snow and ice, and it's really bad. And so he stops at a church. Now this is True Magazine. This came out Christmas time, 2 years after the war. And what they have in here is they tell the story of Patton stopping at this church in Luxembourg. And so what happens is Patton walks in, he goes up to the altar. There's a statue of Mary there, the mother of Jesus, and he basically yells at God. He says, look, you know what's happening here. You know we're on the right, they're on the wrong. You haven't showed up. I want 4 days of good weather. And I mean, he just demands of God, and he actually cusses along the way too. It's cussing God out.
Not the encouraged way to pray, right? I mean, obviously God can handle it. God's big enough, but probably there's better ways to pray than cussing at God. Nonetheless, it's what happened.
That's what he did. And so after he left there, his officers are with him, the chaplains are with him, wrote down his prayer. And they came to him later and said, this is what we heard. Is that what you, and that's, so the magazine came out after they said that is the actual prayer. And what happened was for the next 4 days, he had clear skies. And all the planes got up, and they go after all the Germans, and he gets in and saves all the Americans, turns the war completely around. So on his way back, he stops at the church and apologizes to God for having cussed God out. He said, thank you, you answered my prayers. And this was typical with him. He would stop at churches and pray. And one of the things that happened on his way up there was he already had his chaplain get a prayer card. And this is a prayer card where he wants 250,000 soldiers in the Third Army praying for good weather. And this is what went into effect in Battle of the Bulge. And this is what's credited with actually having turned the weather around. And the chaplain who did this, Chaplain James O'Neill, after the Battle of the Bulge, he called the chaplain and says, you're getting the Bronze Star for heroism because your prayer got answered. And so it really is, this is Christmas Day. That is the Christmas cards. It's great to read.
So yeah, so on the back of it, there's two sides. On the back side, there's a Christmas greeting where he's wishing all the soldiers a Merry Christmas. But on the front side, this is the prayer, and they were assigned on a certain day, you need to start praying this prayer, so there'll be unison in this prayer. Here's what the prayer says. Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech thee of thy great goodness to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle. Graciously hearken to us as soldiers who call upon thee, that armed with thy power we may advance from victory to victory and crush the oppression and wickedness of our enemies and establish thy justice among men and nations. Amen. As we look back historically, it's easy to look at a figure like Patton and recognize he was an incredible military leader in American history, and certainly there's a lot of drama surrounding him, but it's easy for modern historians and modern storytelling to overlook some of the very significant factors of his life. And certainly one of the things that was very important to him was his faith, and there's a lot of really fun historic evidence identifying the role that faith played. And so obviously as we're looking at Christmas, we're getting ready to celebrate the birth of our Savior. Faith is a very important foundation in this nation. It's certainly something, as we look at some of the great heroes from America, faith was a very important part of their lives as well.